there's a way that mercy messes with our heads. And I think in a lot of ways when we just pause for a minute and consider Jesus. Jesus doesn't make sense. That wasn't his main goal, wasn't to make sense. His main goal was to make things right. And the way in which things become right is a path marked by grace and mercy. And as we've been talking about this down and out series, in the first week we talked about the physically down and out, the disabled, those that Jesus encountered at the Bethesda pools and where there was healing as mercy moved out toward the margins. And last week we went up into the northern region of Galilee and we talked about the socio-political margins, the forgotten people in the northern part who were hungry not just for bread but for a Messiah. And today and next week we're kind of talking about the spiritually down and out, those that have been labeled as condemned. And next week, we'll talk about those who are labeled as cursed. From John chapter 8 today and John chapter 9 next week. And here's the thing about kind of the way in which our world operates. Our world is a merit-based society. I don't really feel like we need to explain this a ton. I can just kind of give a few illustrations of it in that we basically define people by what they do. For better and for worse. Like if I told you that there was a person I knew who was a convict. They were incarcerated. What they've done at one point in their life and what they've been sentenced for and the label that they've been given ultimately defines them in our society's eyes. Many of them can never overcome that label. That would be an example of our merit-based society for the worse. For the better, if I told you that I knew an astronaut, you might be like, ooh, an astronaut. Very few humans have been in space. But it's the same system at work there. It's just the opposite direction. Because of something that somebody does, we hold them in high regard. And because of something that somebody else does, we hold them in low regard. And because that's the system that we live in, you and I battle every single day with the hope and belief that our good is going to someday outweigh our bad. Most of us are striving to be good people. Because we want to make sure the scales balance out or at least tip in the direction of Charlie was a pretty good person. He was more astronaut than convict. Do you know what that whole system is? It's called self-righteousness. That we're responsible for making ourselves right. And that's why Jesus doesn't make sense. Because mercy moves down and out. The down and out movement of mercy threatens established meritocracies and the elites who perpetuate them. Jesus doesn't make sense to the self-righteous because Jesus isn't interested in our scales. He's not evaluating us based on our performance. He doesn't care how or what we produce. In the eyes of Christ, both the astronaut and convict are worthy. But we're so caught up in labels of good and bad. Grace can be threatening to those who are self-righteous. And that's what we see in John chapter 8. John chapter 8, verses 1 through 6 show an established meritocracy and the elites who preserve it threatened by this movement of mercy down and out. And you may have a little note here that says the earliest manuscripts do not include 753 through 811. This story, it shows up in the ancient manuscripts in the Old text. It kind of pops up in different places. A few different places in John's gospel, or even one situation that ends up in Luke's gospel. And so what we have here is an old story about something Jesus did, but we're not entirely sure when it happened. We just know with a high degree of certainty that it happened. And it could be at any point in Jesus' life because Jesus was constantly coming up against this establishment and the elites who preserve it. But what you have here in chapter 8, verse 1, or kind of the end of chapter 7, verse 53, is that each person had gone to their own house, but Jesus had gone to the Mount of Olives. And early in the morning, he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him, and Jesus sat down and taught them. The scribes and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst of all the people, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" They said this to to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. The up and in, the elites within the establishment, wanted to trap Jesus. And so they objectify this woman who has been caught in a very vulnerable position, and they bring her into the company of all the people in the temple that are gathered to hear Jesus teach, in order to set a trap for Jesus. They want to catch him in the public eye so that they can charge him and ultimately kill him, because his movement is restoring and, more importantly, rallying the down and out. The movement of mercy is flowing counter their meritocracy, and it feels like power is being distributed to the margins rather than up and in like they're used to. Nobody is more threatened by Jesus than the self-righteous. Nobody is more threatened by Jesus than the self-righteous. While Jesus is teaching, I mean, you have to get, it's hard to read a story and then kind of put it into modern context, but this is going to tell you more about me than you probably need to know. In my mind, this is Jerry Springer. Like, when you think of the magnitude of this drama, the woman is caught in the act of adultery. There's a crowd gathered. They bring her out in the midst. Jesus is sitting in front of everybody because he had been teaching them probably about things like grace and mercy and the kingdom of God. And here comes this woman thrust in front of him, and you can hear it, Jerry, 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 Jerry. This is kind of like, no, again, this is more about me than you know. This is then shifting to like Judge Judy situation, okay? So we've got this Jerry Springer type frenzy that turns into a Judge Judy situation. And they want to know, Jesus, this woman is guilty, and the law, Moses himself commanded us to stone women like this, to stone people who are caught in adultery. What do you say? And then it turns the corner to a legal drama. And you see Jesus trying to process what is going to happen in the midst of this courtroom scenario. The ultimatum that he's been delivered is to oppose the law or to fall in line. Jesus, either you're going to tell us to do the opposite of what Moses told us to do, or you're going to fall under our authority where you belong. We're the self-righteous. We're the top. We're the up and in, and this is how the system works. Quit restoring the down and out, and quit rallying the margins with this concept of mercy. We live in a merit-based world. What you do determines your worth. And this woman, worthless. So what is Jesus going to do? John chapter 8, verse 6 started with him drawing in the sand. He bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. As they continued to ask him, as they continued hounding him, he stood up finally and he said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." This is Jesus jiu-jitsu. He absorbed the full force of their frontal attack and trap and completely reversed it to his advantage. He says in his response, the law is the law. The law is the law. This woman is guilty. How do I know that Jesus says she's guilty? Some people want to make a point that Jesus doesn't really see her as guilty. Maybe she's a vulnerable and marginalized woman, and there's all this stuff that could maybe justify why she has to end up in the situation she's in. Maybe it's a lesser sin that we don't really know about. I mean, in those days and age, if a woman showed her hair, she could be called an adulteress. We don't know what the situation is about all this stuff. Maybe there are people who want to minimize the sin, but Jesus says later on, he tells her to go and sin no more. So I'm just going to call sin what Jesus calls sin in this situation and say she isn't a legit adulteress. The law is the law. And Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. But he says this, the fulfillment of the law is love. While the law is the law, love is love. And while this woman is guilty, she is also worthy. She is worthy of life. She may be guilty of adultery, but she is worthy of life. And life eternal. She is more than the worst thing she's ever done. The self-righteous crowd was blocking the encounter of grace. They were blocking it even for themselves. This aristocratic system, this meritocracy that they find themselves was blocking them from the experience, from the true heart of the law. The true heart of the law is mercy and restoration and repair between the relationship between God and people. The entire sacrificial system is built not so that we can identify who should be stoned, but so that we would have a means to restore our relationship with God. These people had lost sight of that. They were blocked from grace and mercy. They did not know the heart of God because they were sitting at the top of a system that worked for them. And as long as there are guiltier people below you, you will work to preserve the merit-based systems. As long as there are criminals out there, we feel more like astronauts, don't we? But the crowd was also blocking this woman from an encounter with Jesus. And I wonder today how many aristocratic, self-righteous Christians are blocking the world from Christ. Once the crowd disperses, the woman encounters Jesus. And here's the irony of this. Jesus' statement, let him who is without sin throw the first stone. By the time the entire crowd disperses, starting with the oldest one, starting with those at the very tippy top of the meritocracy, starting with the most elite of the elites, as all of those disperse, and as all the self-righteous follow, as the crowd leaves and the woman is left alone with, guess who? The only one who by this standard can actually stone her. Woman. I just can't imagine what she felt in that moment. At least it would have been a quick death if the whole crowd threw rocks at one time. This guy's going to throw 100 rocks at me, and that's how I'm going to die, because he's the only one without sin. But the only one who could throw a stone had already chosen to carry a cross. Jesus knew how he was going to make this relationship right again. And it wasn't going to be by murdering the condemned. When I think about the cosmic gospel, I think Jesus could throw so many stones. Like, you guys remember the Exodus story, right? The plagues that came upon Egypt. One of the plagues was hailstones from heaven. The sky rained down rocks on people. Like, I think Jesus could do that in this moment. At the time, he could just be like, hailstones. He could hit the high priest. He could hit the Pharisees and scribes. He could hit all these self-righteous people. He's like, boom, boom, boom. I think, man, Jesus might look throughout the whole world and he thinks, you know what? It's probably just easier to send a comet, like a big cosmic comet, just boom, right into Earth, right? Or he can maybe take that big moon of Jupiter. Jupiter's got enough moons, it doesn't need another one. He can just send it flying toward Earth, right? And just smack us and turn us into cosmic dust and start over again. He could throw so many stones. He could take his finger and just nudge our planet a little closer to the sun so that all of us melt. He could take that same finger and he could swirl our universe into a big black hole. But instead, he takes his finger and he touches the dirt. We have no idea what he wrote. I don't think it matters. What matters is that the hand of God makes contact with earth. It's an incarnation. In the flesh, God is displaying his saving love. That's what he told us back at the beginning of John's gospel. The Son came to do. God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world. Jesus didn't come to throw stones. He did not come to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in Jesus is not condemned. The Son displays God's saving love. His fingers dig into the dirt where heaven touches earth, and he glorifies the dust. He turns the dust into glory. By the end of chapter 8, do you know what happens at the end of chapter 8? You guys just want me to tell you so I don't have to read it later? You know what the crowd does at the end of chapter 8? They try to throw stones at Jesus. But do you see what John did here in the construction of this story? What began with a crowd trying to throw stones at a woman ends with a crowd trying to throw stones at Jesus. Jesus takes the woman's place. She goes free, and he subjects himself to the power of the crowd. The God who could throw cosmic stones instead sets his stake in the ground through a cross and says, not you. You're worthy of life. I will pay the price. The movement of mercy toward the down and out. An encounter with grace, an encounter with mercy, an encounter with Christ sets the condemned free. The condemned, the down and out, are freed by grace. Jesus says, woman, look around, look around. The crowd no longer condemns you. They become exposed to their own self-righteousness. It's almost like you know how a lot of us like looking out the window at our neighbors and seeing all the things they do wrong? But then we pull the blind so they can't look in the house to see what we do wrong? You know, it's like we all love like our Ring cameras that face out, but we would be mortified if I had in-home monitor footage of your household. It has something to do with what Jesus said about specks and logs, right? Like we're always concerned about the speck in somebody else's eye rather than the log in our own. Jesus had taken the crowd and he turned their window into a mirror. And they looked and they said, this self-righteous thing doesn't work because I too am a sinner. I need something beyond this system to save me. Jesus says, look, at the crowd is gone because they've realized that they're not worthy of condemning you, but neither do I. I do not condemn you. Go and sin no more. You are freed by grace. In Romans chapter 8, verse 1, it says that there is no condemnation for those in Christ. If you have been living, even as a Christian, with condemnation, it's not how God sees you. This woman enters the temple that day an adulteress, but she leaves that day a daughter of God. Go and sin no more. When the crowd was screaming guilt, Jesus was speaking grace. When everybody around you calls you by a sin label, Jesus says you are worthy of love and life. Did you know there is no greater transformative force in the universe that's capable of energizing actual life change more than the love of God? Nothing changes people more than the love of God. Guilt might modify your behavior for a time. I feel guilty about the extra weight I'm carrying. And I'll probably crash diet just to feel better about myself for a little while. Because that's what guilt does. Guilt modifies behavior. Guilt does not change hearts. Only grace can do that. Only love can change a heart. God is not a God of behavior modification, setting up some Christian meritocracy. God is a God of heart transformation who wants to live in loving relationship with you. Grace will change your life, while guilt may only change your behaviors. And so I just think today, I think everybody has something to lay down today. For some of us, we might have walked in a little self-righteous, feeling more astronaut than criminal. And we might look at certain types of people and we see their sin and we think, man, we got the stone in my hand. And this is what they deserve. And the reason I'm worthy of throwing this stone is because I'm so good. Well, at least better than them. Some of us just need to lay down those stones so that those who are down and out might actually have a chance to encounter the grace of God. Some of us have been blocking people in our lives from mercy, and we're living and carrying the burdens of our own merit, the pressure of feeling like, will this scale ultimately bear out in my favor or not? Drop the stones. But unlike the crowd that day that walked away from Jesus, drop the stones and come to Christ. Stay with him. Stay with him and see how he treats the woman. It might change you also. And some of us, if you just would stand with us today, this is the last thing. I want you to think about it, because I want you to remember your own story today. And maybe even mark a moment today in your own story. Some of us have been carrying labels that make us feel unworthy of God's love. For the woman that day, it was adulteress. And we could sit here right now, we could just kind of go through like list upon list upon list, right, of all the things that we probably carry at any given moment. But there's probably something in your heart, some label, some word that you think when Jesus looks at you, you think that's the word that comes to mind. That's what he thinks of you. And if you could just get alone with him today, you would know without a shadow of a doubt how loved you are. If you've been feeling down and out, like some besetting sin has pushed you to the margins, if you've been feeling like you deserve a cosmic hailstone, I want you to come to Christ. And I want you to just leave that label behind. That woman walked a new path home that day. And we don't know which home she went to. But I imagine she found that her heavenly home, her eternal home, set a new path from the temple that day. So today, my prayer for you is that you would encounter mercy and that you would walk a new path home. In Jesus' name.